Hi, this video lecture replaces your class that was scheduled for April 1st. I'll be back on April 3rd. That's Wednesday, and we'll review the material, and you'll have a test schedule for Friday, April 5th. What I'd like to talk about today is the firm and why firms exist. There's basically two theories. They're compatible theories. They complement each other. One was developed by two economists, Armin Alchian and Harold Demsetz at UCLA, and they saw the firm as necessary for metering and monitoring team production. The other theory is one that was developed by Ronald Coase, which is based on transaction costs and reducing the costs associated with market activity. Now, I'd like to start with the Demsetz and Alchian theory. If you recall, we talked about the guild system and guild production that lasts for about 1,000 years, and that was based on individual craftsmanship. These are very skilled craftsmen organized into guilds. The work that they did was stamped with the mark of the guild hall, and they signed it. And they were responsible for their own work. But with the rise of the factories and the application of machinery to production, things changed fundamentally. These machines were hooked to a power source, and they spewed out their product 24/7. And there may be 25, 50, 100 workers or more working with this machine, and it was very hard to determine how much of that production was due to any particular worker, as well as the machinery. The entrepreneur that put this together, they went to quite a bit of expense to create the machine, build the factory, and how much was due to that, and how much was due to the workers who worked on it. Well, this created a particular problem. In the old guilds, each craftsman was responsible for their own work. If someone was making a table, if they were slow, if they were shirking, if they were not very skilled, they bore the consequences of that. So their effort was reflected in the value of what they produced and how much they produced. But in the factories, this was different. When you're part of a team, and this is what the factory is based on, team production, not craftsmanship. But when you're part of a team, it requires team effort. If someone on that team shirks or doesn't do a good job, other people pay the cost of that. So you have a problem with shirking because shirkers pass the costs of their actions on to others. For example, consider sports. Right now, it's the March basketball tournament, the March Madness, and you watch those teams, and the outcome of their games depends not on the efforts of one single player, but on everybody that's out there on the floor. And so it's a real team outcome. Well, if one player, decides, well, we're in a big city, lots of things going on here. I really don't want to keep curfew. I want to go out and party. And so the night before the big game, they're out partying. They get up at 3 in the morning. The next day, they don't perform well. Well, that doesn't just affect them. That affects every other player on that team. And if you want to prevent shirking, you need to have a way of metering and monitoring people to prevent it. That's one of the functions of a coach. They establish a curfew. Players have to be in by 10 o'clock on game, the night before the game. And then they also have to, that's called monitoring, make sure that they comply with the rules. And then you have to meter their performance. Well, the coach is over there watching the game, the players are out there performing, and he's evaluating each player as they perform. How are they doing? Maybe I need to put in a substitute. Maybe they're getting tired. Maybe they're having an off day. So this is the job of the coach, that you have to have someone who can meter and monitor the team to enforce the rules if you want to get the most out of that team. Now with the firm, it worked the same way. If you were going to get, 50 people or 100 people together to work in a factory with this piece of machinery, how do you get everybody to put out the necessary effort and take the necessary care in performing their task? You have to have someone, a foreman, somebody who's going to watch over, somebody who's going to enforce the rules, somebody who's going to evaluate the workers and try to reward those who are good workers and punish or not reward those who are slackers, or who are shirking. So the firm is an authoritarian environment where you have a foreman, you have a coach, you have somebody who's ruling over this environment. So there's a big difference between the guild work hall, where everybody is responsible for their own actions, and if one person screws up, if Herman comes in after a wedding reception and he's hungover and he screws up his work, the others laugh at him. Hey, Herman, look what you did. You just ruined 3 years of work on this project. But it doesn't affect them. It only affects Herman. This is what Elchin and Demsetz hypothesized was the main function of the firm. And this explains why workers flocked to these authoritarian places. They weren't led there in chains. Yeah, there was discipline here, but they went there because they wanted the wages. They wanted the job. And you can criticize the firms and the factories and say, oh, these workers were exploited. But the workers flocked there. And the reality is, after the Industrial Revolution, after the development of factories, millions of more people were able to survive than ever before. There was a huge population boom. And this wasn't because the workers were being starved to death. This was because more was being produced than had ever been produced before. Under the guild system, you had the one percenters, the aristocracy, the church and the lords and the aristocrats. They were immensely wealthy. And then you had the guilds in the towns. That was your middle class, but that was a very small segment of the population. 85% of the population was in poverty and living on the brink of starvation. And every time there was a bad crop, they died. I mean, that was the limiting factor of population growth. Was you couldn't feed the people. Now, with the industrial age, you had a huge population boom because many more people could live and survive. So that's one function of the firm, is to meter and monitor production and to eliminate shirking in the firm. The other theory of the firm comes from Ronald Coase. And he hypothesized that the reason firms exist is to reduce transaction costs associated with the marketplace. And Coase is one of my favorite professors. He came over here from England shortly after getting his PhD. He was teaching at University of Chicago. But the first year that he was in the United States, he traveled around to talk to different owners and managers of companies, large and small, to try to find out why firms exist. Why do you do what you do? What is your What is your main purpose? And in 1937, he wrote an article on theory of the firms. And when he did, people said, what in the world are you talking about? This makes no sense at all. They didn't buy into it at all. But in 1991, almost 30 years later, well, 1991, it would have been 50 years later, he was awarded a Nobel Prize in economics for his developing the theory of the firm. Because suddenly, by that time, we started to get the internet and the dot-com revolution, and this changed a lot of things, and people said, hey, this is what Coase was talking about 50 years ago. And we didn't understand him, but now we understand exactly what he's talking about, and we see the relevance of what he was talking about. So I would really like to look at what Coase had to say, what he was talking about. Because he said, what threw everybody off was he said that the firm is a non-price institution. And everybody's used to thinking of the firm as part of the and parcel of the market system based on prices and everything. But he was looking at the internal structure of the firm. And to explain, I think it's sometimes easier to explain Coase by starting, instead of the firm, with the family. And, the family was actually, up until the 1880s, the majority of production in America took place within families, farm families, not in factories. And even today around the world, in many of these lesser developed countries or countries that are just starting to develop, you'll find that most of the production in those countries takes place within families. Like on the American frontier, you had the farm families, and they had 12 or 15 kids, and down the road were all their aunts and uncles, and they grew their own food, prepared their own, preserved their own jams and jellies, made their own bread, made all their food at home. They made their own furniture. They made their own clothes. They sewed their own clothes. So they did produced pretty much everything they needed. And then when harvest time came, if they had some extra food, they sold it. They got some cash. They went to town. They bought the store-bought goods. But on a day-to-day basis, most of what they used and consumed, they made themselves. Now, within the family, resources are not allocated by price. There's usually a matriarch or a patriarch or somebody within that family who runs that family who tells everybody what they're going to do. And this is not done on the basis of price. This is done on the basis of central direction. Now, you take McNeese, for example, as a firm. We don't put prices on our different resources we use. If the computer's broken, I need a new computer in the classroom. They don't tell me, well, that's going to cost X amount of money. They tell me if it's in the budget or not. If I need more chalk, I go and I say I'm out of chalk. They say, oh yeah, well, our supplies are running low because we don't have this in our budget, or we don't have that in our budget. Well, who makes up the budget? Well, the budget's made up on the fourth floor of the building by the administrators. The deans make their budget and send it up there, and then the vice presidents get together and they make theirs. And all of this is centrally directed. It's like a little sort of Soviet central planning state where they make their plans at the top, and everything filters down to the bottom. And resources are not allocated according to price. In the same way in the family. So you had these firms, and they consist of a bundle of different activities that were performed within the firm, where they meter and monitor them. And these firms would then transact with other firms through the market to contract for those, or to outsource for those services that other firms could provide better than they could. Yeah, so these firms were islands of non-market activity in a sea of market activity. And this allowed these firms to become more and more specialized. To make this clear, let's consider what are all the possible activities that could take place within a firm. Well, you've got production, you've got management, you've got personnel, you've got janitorial, warehousing, advertising or marketing, you got maintenance, you got shipping. We could come up with a long list of all these different activities that firms do. And then you ask yourself, which of those activities is essential to the firm? If the firm doesn't do it, then it's not a firm. And the answer is none. You have firms that don't produce. They buy products from a factory, and they package them and they market them and they warehouse them and they distribute them, but they don't make them. You have firms that don't manage. You have firms that hire management companies. Up the road at the Coshada Casino, the Indians got a casino. So we want to open up a casino. We don't know anything about running a casino. So they went out and got a company to come in and run the casino for them. Now they handle a lot of the other functions of the casino, but they don't manage it. They hire a company to manage it. You had the Marriott hotels. Marriott sold all their hotels about 30 years ago, 40 years ago. They only manage hotels. They don't own the hotels anymore. They're a management company. So you have companies that only manage, and they contract. You have other companies that contract with them to manage for them. You know, personnel. Some companies have their own personnel offices, but a lot of companies now are contracting out with personnel agencies, outside companies that specialize in personnel. You have warehousing, but you have companies that specialize in warehousing, so that the firms don't have to warehouse. You know, delivery. This is when I was a kid. When you looked around town, you saw delivery trucks everywhere, and they all had the names of the business on the side, Sears and Penny's and all this. Because every store, every business had its own delivery trucks. Grocery stores had delivery trucks. But then back in it was around 1960. There was a company that they actually had to sue the post office, and it went to the Supreme Court to get permission to deliver packages in competition with the post office. Because up until that time, only the post office could handle mail and packages. And I believe that was UPS that took them to the Supreme Court. So UPS got permission to deliver not mail, but packages. And then along came Federal Express and all these other services. Now, if you want a lesson in economics as to competition and the marketplace and profits versus the public sector, it's right there. Because once they allowed private companies to come in and deliver packages for profit, and there was competition among those companies, what's happening in delivery services is phenomenal. You can order goods on the internet one day, and the next day they're at your door. And they can track them worldwide, and they can tell you exactly where they're at. The airlines have no clue as to where your luggage went, but UPS and FedEx know exactly where your package is. These are extremely efficient, and they really transformed that whole delivery service. But those are companies that specialize in those activities. So the firms, you know, they're bundles of different activities. This is what Coase was talking about. They do this, and they do this, and they do this. They have personnel, they have maintenance, they have janitorial. But when they perform these activities, it's on a non-price basis. When they bring that activity inside their firm, then they have to meter and monitor it. And this is where the Elton and Dimsitz theory fits in with the Coase theory. So let me give you another example. I like to give examples. Lawyers. You know, the young lawyers starting out, they often can't afford to have their own secretaries, unless they, you know, if they could join a big legal firm. But generally, if they're working on their own, you'll see 2 or 3 of them will get together, they'll lease a building, and they'll share a legal secretary. Because legal secretaries cost you $35,000, $40,000 a year. And what they do is they advertise for a legal secretary, and then they interview them. And if they think there's a good fit, then they tell them, okay, we're going to hire you, and we're going to pay you $40,000 a year, and this is what we expect you to do. We expect you to be here at 9 o'clock every morning. You have a 1-hour lunch break. You know, this, you have to answer the phones. You have to do any typing that we have. They specify everything in one time. So they go out in the marketplace, and they hire a secretary, and they bring her into the firm one time. And that secretary might be with them for 10 years, so they've only had one market transaction with that secretary in 10 years. Now compare this to a student. A student doesn't need legal secretaries. No student has his own secretary, because they only need typing maybe once or twice a semester. So 30 years ago, when I started teaching at McNeese, my oldest daughter was living with us, and she was a student at McNeese, and she decided to use my computer and my printer and my word processing package to help make some money. And at the time, very few people had, printers and word processing on their computers. And she went around campus. She hung up little posters that I typed term papers. And at the bottom, where she had her phone number at the bottom, so they could just pull it off and they could call her if they needed term paper typed. So, and students would do this. They had a paper they needed typed. They would go around campus, look for somebody who said they typed term papers, and they would call them up and say, "I got a paper due on, in 3 weeks. Can you type it for me?" Now, this is not a simple transaction, because you have both the search cost of trying to find somebody who offers this service and is reliable, and then you have the contracting cost, which is you got to specify, well, what if there's typos on the page? Are you going to retype it for me? How many times are you going to retype it if it's wrong? What if you miss the due date? I'm going to suffer because I'm going to get a penalty. What are you going to do? What are my recourses? And then you have a third cost, which is the cost of enforcing the contract. And anybody who's in small business knows that when you do a job for somebody and they're supposed to pay you in return, you talk to any small businessman and ask them how many times they've been stiffed by a customer. It's hard. There's a cost to enforcing those contracts. So those are the three main costs that Close was looking at: the search costs, the contracting costs, and the enforcement costs of going out in the market. Now, a student will go out in the market because only once in a while do you need a term paper typed, maybe 3 or 4 times in the 4 years you're in college. But imagine if a lawyer tried to do that. Imagine if every time they had a piece of paper to file with the court, they had to run around town looking for somebody who said, "I type legal papers," pulling off phone numbers, calling up people they didn't know, and trying to specify the contract and then trying to enforce it. That's ridiculous. I mean, it'd be ridiculously expensive for them. So they go out, they advertise for a legal secretary, 2 or 3 of them get together, they hire the secretary, they only go out in the market once, they contract one time with them, and they bring them in the firm. Well, when they bring them in the firm, then they have to meter and monitor their performance. So they're avoiding the cost of having to contract repeatedly in the marketplace, but they're incurring the cost of making sure the secretary shows up on time, making sure that she answers the phone properly, making sure that she types the legal papers accurately, and they have to monitor her and they have to meter her. So when a firm has to consider whether to perform a task themselves or whether to contract with an outside firm to provide that service, they have to consider their marginal costs and their marginal benefits. So on this graph, we're going to have the different tasks that a firm could perform on the horizontal axis. And we're going to arrange them from those that are the most costly in the marketplace to those that are the least costly to conduct. And on a vertical axis, we have money measured up here. Now, the marginal benefits of including these different activities in the firm is going to be downward sloping, because we're going from those that will save us the most down to those that will save us the least. And while the marginal benefits are decreasing, the marginal cost of bringing these activities into the firm is going to be increasing. That's because the more you try to do within the firm, the more difficult it is to successfully meter and monitor them. So these are the marginal benefits, these are the marginal costs. And so what determines the size of the firm, or how many tasks that it performs, is their ability to monitor and meter those costs and the savings that they will obtain from the marketplace. Now, but if you go out to those plants, whether it's PPG or Philips or Citgo, any of the big plants out there, those aren't their own security guards. Those are contracted security guards. They work for an agency that specializes in security services. Why? Because Philips will say, we're a refinery. We're not in the security business. Now, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, when I was a teenager, when I was working in the GM factory, so all those guards were GM employees. All the maintenance people, all the janitorial people, they had a cafeteria, the cafeteria people, all those people were part of General Motors. They were General Motors employees. But if you go to a firm today and you say to Philips, how many employees do you have? They'll say, we have 700 Philips employees. Well, how many people are working at the plant? Oh, there's about 1,800. Oh, wait, what about the other 1,100 that are working at the plant? Oh, they're contract employees. Meaning that they're not employing those people directly, but they're contracting with other companies to provide those employees. And those are service companies. It could be the guards in the booths when you come in and out of the plants, or it could be maintenance people. McNeese, the university, we have maintenance workers that take care of the buildings. They used to be McNeese employees. About a year ago, they contracted out that service. Now those are the same employees, but now they work for a private company that manages those workers. Manages means they meter and monitor. They make sure that they're doing their job, and they measure how good they're doing their job. But we have our own police. That's the McNeese Police. You go to most universities around the country, don't have their own police. Well, they may have campus police, but they don't run them. They hire those police, just like Philips does, through a security service, because that's a specialty area where they have to be trained. They have to know how to respect people's rights and all those things. So this is what we call contracting out. Contracting out is when a firm contracts with another firm to provide that service to them. If you look at what's been going on in the American economy, and you say, oh, we have the deindustrialization of America. Oh, the fastest growing sector is the service sector. Well, what's happening is, you look at like General Motors 50 years ago with all their own employees, all the security guards and everything. They're now contracting those out. And those security guard services are part of the private sector. Delivery. You don't have Sears and Penny's and all these companies running their own delivery trucks around town. It's all Federal Express, UPS. That's the growing service sector. You're seeing more accounting services that used to be done within the firm. Now they're contracting with outside accounting firms, and that's part of that service sector, that growing service sector. And what it does is it allows the company to specialize in doing what they do best. So Conoco, they refine gasoline, and that's what they want to do. They don't want to run gas stations, those gas stations that have Phillips 66 on them or Conoco. Those are not Conoco stations. Most of them are owned by somebody else. They don't want to have to meter and monitor security guards. to get another company to do that. You know, so they want to just make concentrate, specialize on what they do best, and they want to contract out those things that they don't do best. And that's what's going on in the United States. It's going on worldwide, because with the internet now, they're able to contract for services all around the world. You know, you call in these credit card companies, and you're talking to somebody who's over in India. You know, and they're not even in the United States, but they're contracting out that phone service portion of their business. Now, we started out talking about the family. The same thing has happened within the family. You know, when you look at all those services that the family used to do, and you look at what the family does today, you know, we don't bake our own pies or bake our own bread. Increasingly, we contract out food preparation. I mean, how many times a week do you eat out at McDonald's or you know, Pizza Hut or one of these places? How many times a week do you prepare food? I mean, when I was a kid, it was maybe once a month you went out and ate. Today, you have people who eat out and have their food made in the market, you know, 10, 12 times a week. When I was a kid, I mean, you know, 50 years ago, entertainment was provided within the home. Very few people had housekeepers to come in. Children, you know, young children, you didn't send them to nursery school. The mother worked, and the mother specialized in household production, taking care of the children and cleaning the house. But today, that's all contracted out. And the wife in the family, the female, used to specialize in home production. Now they go out into the marketplace, they get a job, and they contract out all these household services to someone else. When you talk to a working mother and you ask them how much they make, they're not most of them are not netting a whole lot, because they have to pay for child care and a lot of other services when they're working. But what's happened is that we have fewer functions performed in the home. I was watching Who Wants to Be a Millionaire a couple of years ago, and had a question on there: who was the first American president born in a hospital? And the answer to that was Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton's my age. He was born in 1946. First American president born in a hospital. Because prior to that, babies weren't born at home. I mean, babies weren't born in hospitals, they were born at home. You had midwives who came. You didn't run to the hospital when you were sick, you were treated at home. Doctors made house calls because that's where the patients were. They weren't in the hospitals, they were in the homes, because that's where they were cared for. You know, my mother had a sewing machine. She made most of our clothes when I was growing up. And this was true of the families 50 years ago, 100 years ago. That's where production took place. Today, what production takes place in the family? It's almost all contracted out through the market. But there's a reason for that. And the reason is the cost of transacting in the marketplace has fallen tremendously, and especially with the internet. I was watching on TV the other day, I saw an ad for Angie's List. Angie's List. That's a big web company now. And what they do is, if you need somebody to come for household maintenance, you need a plumber or a carpenter, electrician, you can go to Angie's List, and they have ratings. They evaluate local people, who's the good ones and who's the reliable ones. And you know what that's doing? That's reducing the cost of market search. That's a huge part of transacting in the marketplace. And if you reduce the cost of market search, you make it easier to transact in the marketplace. And that makes it easier to outsource tasks. Instead of doing them yourself, you're going to acquire them through the market. You're going to specialize and earn money in the area where you're most productive, and you're going to contract out for those others. But that's what Ronald Coase's idea was. That's why it was so timely in 1991, and they finally realized what he was talking about, and they gave him a Nobel Prize for it. Thank you very much.